What would you do if, to ensure your children didn't starve next winter, you had to abandon your newborn baby in the snow to die? And what if that decision wasn't seen as monstrous, but as a cold, logical necessity for your family's survival? Imagine the smell of peat smoke and animal fat, an acrid scent soaked into the wool of your clothes, a blend that never leaves you. Feel the biting cold of the north wind on your face as you mend a fence, your hands cracked and bleeding from the ceaseless work. Hear the constant sound of your children's coughs inside the dark longhouse, a reminder of life's fragility, mixed with the murmuring of the animals sleeping just feet away from you for shelter from the cold. This is not a literary invention for a fantasy novel. This was the brutal arithmetic of daily existence for the vast majority of men and women we now call Vikings. What you are about to hear is not the story of the kings and saga heroes the television series so love. It is the untold truth of the mud, the backbreaking labor, and the impossible choices that defined the real life of a Viking. The truth behind the myth. To understand that life, you must first understand the land that forged it. Journey with me to the end of the 8th century, to Scandinavia. Do not picture green and fertile meadows. Picture a land of rock, a stubborn and ancient land with scarce patches of arable soil wrested from nature with sweat and blood. Imagine deep fjords, scars of ice on the face of the world, cutting into the continent like the fingers of a frozen god. The climate is a relentless tyrant. Winters are an eternity of darkness and brutal cold. The sun becomes a pale memory, and each year farming is a high-stakes gamble. A bad harvest doesn't mean smaller profits, it means death. Survival depends on every stored grain, every salted fish. The sea is not just a highway to glory and plunder, as we have been told. It is, first and foremost, the main source of life. It is the fish on your table, the seal fat for your lamp, the promise that perhaps there will be enough to make it to spring. In this unforgiving land, society was not a unified empire. Forget the idea of a Viking nation. The reality was a mosaic of petty kingdoms, of clans and extended families, each ruled by a local chieftain. The social structure was as rigid and cold as the winter. At the top were the jarls, the nobility, the owners of the land and the ships. Below them, forming the immense white majority, were the carls. You, most likely, would have been one of them. A free man or woman, yes, but bound to the land. A farmer, a craftsman, a fisherman. And at the very bottom of it all were the thralls, the slaves. Captured in raids or born into servitude, they were the foundation upon which this society was built. Subjects with no rights, considered property. In this world, the most valuable currency was not silver, but your honor, your reputation. An offense to your family was not a lie, simple insult. It was a debt that could only be paid with silver or with blood. Vengeance was not an act of passion, but a social obligation that could chain generations in cycles of violence. And here lies the first great truth we must tear down. The lives of the majority were not defined by war, but by the farm. Most Scandinavians never left their land. They never saw the shores of England. Viking was not a people. It was an activity. It was a summer job. It was to go a Viking, to embark on an expedition of trade, exploration, or plunder. But when that expedition ended, you came home. You came back to the land, to the livestock, to the daily struggle for survival. And it is in that struggle, far from the battlefield, where the true and brutal Viking story is found. Now, come inside with me. Cross the threshold of the Viking longhouse, the heart of this world. Forget the vast, brightly lit banquet halls of television shows. The reality is a fortress of smoke and sickness. The air is thick, a soup of smells that hits you. Smoke from the central hearth which burns without a chimney. Human sweat, the sharp stench of excrement from the animals you've brought inside so they don't freeze to death. And the aroma of food, an eternal stew simmering over the fire. The darkness is almost total. Your eyes struggle to adjust, barely making out shapes in the gloom. The only light comes from the fire, which casts dancing, terrifying shadows on the wooden walls. The floor is not stone, or wood. It is packed earth, cold and damp beneath your bare feet or simple leather shoes. This proximity to the animals, sleeping beside you, is a vital necessity. Their body heat helps fight the killing cold of winter. But it is a pact with the devil. This warmth comes with parasites and diseases that jump from them to you, to your children. Archaeologists who have excavated Viking latrines tell an invisible and terrible story. They have found massive evidence of intestinal worms, parasites, that plagued the population, weakening their bodies and making every day a silent battle against illness. Life here is communal to the extreme. Privacy is a concept that does not exist. You sleep on wooden benches built against the walls, next to your parents, your children, your servants, and your guests. The cough of a sick child echoes in the shared space, an echo that constantly reminds everyone how thin the line is between life and death. But stop. Do not get carried away by the image of a filthy barbarian. This is where reality becomes fascinatingly complex. Despite sleeping next to their cows, Vikings were, by the standards of their time, obsessed with hygiene. Archaeology doesn't lie. Finely carved combs, tweezers, ear scoops, and even razors have been found in countless graves. An English chronicler, John of Wallingford, complained bitterly that the Danes were far too popular with English women. The reason? They bathed every Saturday, combed their hair daily, and changed their clothes with a frequency that scandalized their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. In fact, the word for Saturday in Scandinavian languages, lørdag, literally means washing day. When travelers from other cultures like the Arab Ibn Fadlan described them as dirty, it was often due to a culture clash. He was horrified to see a group of men share the same basin of water to wash their faces in the morning. But it wasn't a lack of cleanliness, rather a different communal custom. The average Viking was likely far cleaner and better groomed than the average Frankish or Saxon peasant. Now look at the woman stoking the fire. She is not a shield maiden of legend, though such figures existed in mythology. She is the manager, the lady and mistress of this small universe, the Husfreyja. Her power is real and visible. Listen to the jingle of the bunch of iron and bronze keys hanging from her belt. They are not an ornament. They are the symbol of her absolute authority over the pantry, the livestock, the silver coffers, and the slaves. She is the one who manages all the farm's resources. Feel the roughness of raw wool in your hands. This woman's life is defined by an endless cycle of work. She spends countless hours spinning and weaving to clothe her entire family. To weave a single tunic required weeks of preparation. It is estimated that for every day of weaving, 35 hours of prior spinning were required. And here lies another paradox. In a brutal era, Viking women enjoyed rights that would surprise many European women centuries later. They could own property in their own name, inherit land from their parents, and crucially, they could initiate a divorce if their husband was abusive, lazy, or unable to provide for the family. However, this domestic power clashed with an extreme biological vulnerability. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences of her life. In a world without modern hygiene or medicine, maternal and infant mortality rates were terrifyingly high. Every pregnancy was a life or death gamble. And this brings us to one of the darkest realities. The decision to expose a newborn, to abandon it to the elements, was a real and grim practice. If a baby was born sick, deformed, or was simply one more mouth the family could not feed, especially if it was a girl, it could be left to die. This was not an act of evil, but a terrible choice, dictated by the cold arithmetic of scarcity. When the men went raiding, the Husfreyja took full control. She was not a passive figure awaiting her husband's return. She was the one who made decisions about planting, harvesting, defending the farm, and managing everyone who lived on it. Her life was a constant duality, a pillar of power in her home, yet a prisoner of an unforgiving cycle of labor and biological peril. That arithmetic of scarcity defined everything. For most Vikings, the real battle was not fought with axes against Saxons, but with plows against the rocky earth. The struggle was not for glory, but against hunger. Imagine the muscle-burning effort of pushing a primitive plow through a field full of stones. Hear the screech of the iron blade scraping against rock, a sound that promises exhausting work for an uncertain reward. Taste the flavor of daily life. It is not the golden mead of the sagas. That was a luxury drink, reserved for feasts and chieftains. Your diet is a monotony of grain porridge, hard bread, and dried or salted fish. With luck, a little boiled meat from Eifo, time to time, and some root vegetables you've managed to grow. You don't even drink water often. It is frequently contaminated and dangerous. The main drink is a very weak, almost non-alcoholic beer or buttermilk. It's safer and provides much-needed calories. Here we understand the true engine of the Viking Age. It wasn't just greed or a thirst for adventure. It was, in large part, desperate need. A bad harvest, a late spring, a summer too rainy, all of it meant starvation. The plunder of a distant, undefended monastery was not just an act of violence, it was an insurance policy. It was the silver that would buy grain from your neighbors, the food that would fill your children's stomachs during the long winter. Even the social structure was shaped by this pressure. The selective infanticide of girls may have created a demographic imbalance, a society with a surplus of young men with no land or prospects. For them, joining a Viking expedition was not a choice. It was the only way out, the only way to gain wealth, status, and perhaps find a wife. And at the base of this entire economic system, do not forget, were the slaves, the thralls. They were the ones who did the hardest labor, who plowed those impossible fields, who built the ships. Their lives had no legal value. They were human tools. The concept of winter was synonymous with death. When the first snow fell, the family would retreat into the longhouse. They would huddle together, rationing food with meticulous care, telling the stories of gods and heroes to ward off the darkness and fear that lurked outside and within. Each day was a small victory, an anxious wait for their provisions to last until the thaw. And when illness or injury struck, there was no comfort in science. Viking medicine was a battlefield between practical experience and superstition. Imagine a warrior who falls in battle with a deep wound to the stomach. There is no way to know if it's fatal. The test was brutally simple and strangely poetic. He was given a strong soup to drink, made with onion, leek, and fragrant herbs. Then, the healer would approach the wound and smell it. If the aroma of the soup seeped through the cut, it meant the intestinal wall was perforated. There was nothing to be done. Death was certain. The primary healers were women. They used an ancestral knowledge of herbs, mosses, and roots to treat ailments, mixing it with charms and rituals to invoke the help of the gods. Pain was a constant in everyone's life. Teeth were worn down to the root by the coarse diet and the grit that mixed with the flour. Arthritis deformed joints from decades of grueling physical labor. And any wound, no matter how small, could become infected and turn into a slow, agonizing death sentence. Far from being lawless anarchists who lived by the might of the axe, the Vikings had a surprisingly sophisticated and deeply communal legal system. They had no kings dictating laws from a throne. They had the thing. Imagine an open-air assembly, on a sacred hill or an open field. The free men of the community gather in a circle, their weapons in hand, not necessarily to fight, but as a symbol of their status. In the center is not a judge in a robe, but a law speaker. This man, respected for his prodigious memory, does not read from a book. He recites from memory the ancestral laws of his people, an oral code passed down through generations. Here, land disputes were debated, thefts and murders were judged, marriages were arranged. Justice was a public affair, a fervent debate where every free man had a voice. And here is the strangest revelation. There were no prisons. The concept of locking someone up as punishment was alien to their mindset. Punishments were mostly fines. If you killed a man, you didn't go to the gallows. You had to pay the weregild, the man price, to his family. This financial compensation was meticulously calculated according to the victim's social status. The goal was not punishment, but to restore balance and, above all, to prevent a cycle of bloody vengeance between families. But the worst punishment was not death. It was to be declared an outlaw. This meant total ostracism. You lost all legal protection. All your property was confiscated. Your life was now worthless. Anyone could kill you without fear of reprisal, and no one could offer you food or shelter under penalty of suffering the same fate. To be an outlaw was to be a walking dead man. Justice, therefore, was a deeply personal and communal matter. If you felt wronged, it was your responsibility to bring the case to the thing. And your success depended not only on the facts, but on your reputation, your honor, and the number of relatives and friends you could muster to support your cause. If words were not enough, disputes could be settled by a ritualized duel. the Holmgang. It was fought in a demarcated space, following strict rules. It was not just about martial skill. It was believed that the gods would grant victory to the one who was in the right. And finally, we come to the violence. It was real. It was brutal. But it was different from how we imagine it. Epic battles between massive armies were rare. Viking violence was more often the calculated brutality of the raid and the casual cruelty of daily life. Imagine absolute terror. You are not on a battlefield. You are in a monastery on an isolated coast. You don't see an army approaching. You see the prow of a longship emerging from the mist. A group of swift, efficient, and heavily armed men disembarks and runs towards you. The sound is not the clash of shields in a battle, but that of an axe shattering a wooden door, followed by screams. They are not looking to conquer your land. They are looking for gold, silver, and above all, people. The capture and sale of slaves was the main economic engine of many of these expeditions. But the violence was not limited to foreign enemies. Sometimes it turned inward towards the gods. In religious rituals, the blots, animals were sacrificed to appease Thor, Odin, Freya, and on special occasions, documented by chroniclers and suggested by archaeology, humans were also sacrificed. Prisoners of war, slaves, or even members of the community offered to the gods to ensure a good harvest or victory in battle. The life of a slave, a thrall, was completely disposable. They could be killed by their masters for any reason, with no legal consequences. And at the funerals of some important chieftains, a female slave would be sacrificed to accompany and serve him in the afterlife. This mentality was forged by the extreme harshness of their existence. Death was a constant companion, whether from disease in the longhouse, starvation during the winter, or the violence of a merciless world. The quest for a place in Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Slain, was not a universal desire for everyone. It was, rather, an ideology for the warrior elite, a way to give meaning and glory to a dangerous and, all too often, incredibly short existence. Imagine for one last moment a Viking man, not on a longship with an axe in his hand, but standing in a frozen field in mid-February. He looks towards his longhouse, from which a thin column of smoke rises. He is not thinking of glory or gold. He is calculating how many sacks of grain are left, whether the livestock will survive until spring, and if the herbal remedy his wife is giving his youngest son will be enough to break the fever. That image, that silent, desperate concern, is the true essence of Viking life. The TV shows sold us the myth of the Viking Superman, a free and indomitable warrior. But the brutal truth is that Viking life was a constant negotiation with death. It was a story of extraordinary resilience, not of power, where the greatest victory was not conquering a kingdom, but simply surviving another winter. After learning this reality, what aspect of daily Viking life has impacted or surprised you the most? Their hygiene, the role of women, or the brutality of survival? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this journey shook you, subscribe to Forgotten Chronicles. Here, we don't just tell history, we relive it.